Carla is an ongoing collaborator with the Georgia Tech Socially Intelligent Machines Lab and a fellow at the innovation firm Smart Design, where she founded the Smart Interaction Lab. Her seminal article, Talking, Walking Objects, appeared on the cover of the New York Times Sunday Review in January of 2013 and is yet a good representation of her view of our robotic future. She currently co-hosts the RoboPsych podcast, a bi-weekly discussion around design and the psychological impact of human-robot interaction. Thank you very much, Carla.
Hi. So I thought I would start this talk by describing my practice, which really straddles three worlds. Design, certainly, academia, and also the art world. And those three feed one another. I often try to challenge myself to work on projects that are installations or experiments because I am interested in our human relationship with technology. And in order to understand that relationship, I feel like I need to feel it in a visceral way. So I find ways to create a project where I can actually build something. And that building is always going back and forth between the physical and the digital, and pulling from the physical world and making it into something that's represented digitally and vice versa. So I pulled out a project that's from several years ago, but was at a residency that I did at a place called the Dora Maar house in the south of France. And in this project, what I was really interested in is my own kind of fascination and lust for the language of consumerism and consumer products, but asking myself if we really needed to have a physical manifestation of that object in order to consume the object. So I called this piece Uber Objects, and I was inspired by a piece that Dora Maar had created. Now, Dora Maar is, best known for her relationship with Picasso. But what I learned when I spent time in the house was how wonderful and how much I connected with her work that dealt with objects and patterns, and also the strife that she went through in the house, because after some psychological abuse, essentially, she became a recluse in the house. There's a lot of sadness in the story, and I was capturing a bit of that. And what I wanted to do, and this seems to be a theme, but I was really interested in the relationship that people had with the house from the outside, because this was this residency that no one in the town really knew, like, what happens in there? Who's in there? And I thought, okay, my piece is going to be all about the people who are on the outside. And so what happens is that there is an object that it actually is a recluse and lives in a shell until somebody spends enough time to engage with it that it emerges from its shell. So this was what someone would see. So this was one of my first experiments in an augmented reality. So then they would have a relationship with them. It would actually see their image, and their image would be reproduced on the screen on this creature character. And this is sort of a precursor to a lot of the work that I've done around social interaction. This is a more recent piece from a few years ago from another residency, and I was interested in exploring capacitive touch, the kind of technology we have when we operate our touch screens, and it's our bodies that break an electromagnetic field. And so I was collaborating with a food designer. We both decided to merge our residencies and make them twice as long, and we did a series of workshops where her expertise was around food and food design. Her name is Emily Baltz, and I was interested in putting sensors in everything. So we kind of did this series of experiments, and what emerged from those was this interest in the gesture of interacting with the food and interacting with an interface in a way that was really unexpected. And of all our food experiments, we were excited about the fact that ice cream was one that you interact with entirely with your tongue, and you can eat without implements. So we created what we called the Lickestra, which is an ice cream orchestra, and here's a little bit of that. So this is a collaboration with a musician named Aaron Dyer as well, who composed music based on the feeling of ice cream. And we did a series of experiments. We showed this in a gallery called Specials at Sea on the Lower East Side, where we had volunteers, and we would kind of have them jam, and we would guide them as the orchestra conductors. And, so balancing things out from the installations that I've done, I've spent several years in consultancies such as Smart Design, as Susan mentioned. And in those places, it, again, was always my focus. I walked in the door saying, I must work on physical things that have digital behaviors, and that's my interest. And so an example of the kinds of things I worked on for the firm is I led the interaction design for this product, which is the Neato vacuum cleaner robot, a competitor to the Roomba that has more advanced technology. And so I worked on, how everything that was interesting to me is how the object actually comes to life, and how our interaction with it shouldn't feel like we're interacting with a foreign thing, but something that we intuitively understand. So we did a series of prototypes. I was interested in our physical bodies and how we relate to the object. So we had an interface that would have very large type and, a very expressive sound palette. Part of my work is actually to lay out all of the behaviors and decide and guide the engineers into, what is the animation that plays, what's the sound that plays, what's the movement. And that's how I break 4D design up into these three pieces, which is sound, light, and movement. And what was a real joy was I was able to hire a composer and a typographer for different parts of this project. And the composer that I hired is a Cranbrook alum who's going to show up later in my presentation. And his name is Scooby Leposki. And we together developed the language or the messages that the robot would have to express, and how the robot would express it in robot language. So this is when it's just starting to go to work. And this is the, oh, hello. So this particular robot has a LiDAR that can see a person and can actually greet them. So these are some errors. What happens when it's full, what happens when it's trapped. This is when it's waking up, and this is when it's going to sleep. Since being at the firm, I've managed my own studio where I do work with clients, but I also, again, challenge myself to create products that are around exploring something I'm interested in. So one of the things I've been very interested in is how we embed natural materials with electronics. So the next piece I call the Clever Coat Rack. And it's a coat rack that is connected to the internet, but when it's not displaying information, it appears as a wooden coat rack. And when someone approaches it is when it comes to life. And it shows you the high temperature, the low temperature, and conditions. In another example of embedding electronics into an environment that would be perhaps unexpected, I was approached by the Museum of Sex that has a cafe that's called the Play Bar. And they had this old English cafe, and were asking for ideas for a system that would let the servers know that the dishes were ready. And so what I was working on was taking their iconography, so they have this tongue and a nose and a mouth, and working on animations where the animations would kind of go crazy when the folks in the kitchen flipped a switch, and then it would settle in on a still of one of the icons. So the servers would know what was going on when they saw this kind of frenzy happening. But to people who were actually sitting and eating at the cafe, they might see something. They might say, "Did you see that? I think the bar just winked at me." But it wouldn't be something that was necessarily communicating with them. It was kind of the secret message between the bar and the servers. And then the main thing that happens in my studio with my clients is I've developed an expertise around designing robots. And this came from early project that I did over 10 years ago with a woman named Dr. Andrea Tamaz, who was at the Georgia Tech Socially Intelligent Machines Lab, is now at UT Austin. And she was looking for a collaborator to be part of the core team for a project that was going to be a robot that would interact with people in a social way. So there is an entire field of academic study that is called social robotics, which I did not realize until 2007 when I met Dr. Tamaz. And I said, "You're kidding. I want to do that." So that has become my real fascination for the last 10 years, and thinking about ways that we take our learning from that and apply it to product design in everyday life, because I see all of our objects, like this microphone right here and this table here and the screen even, as things that we should be able to control in a really intuitive way. So we start with a really exaggerated interface, and this is Simon. So I was part of the core team myself, Andrea Tamaz, and a really wonderful mechanical engineer named Jonathan Holmes. And the idea behind this project is studying how we can give instructions to a machine without having to learn anything about the machine. All we needed to know was how we behave as human beings. What are our social mores? What are our ways that we socially interact? And so this project is called Simon. These are some of Simon's expressions. So a person approaches Simon in a human way by handing it objects. And in this next video, what's happening is an exercise where Simon has cameras in its eyes, it has a microphone, and a person can train Simon to learn to sort colors into a bin. So the person says, "Simon, where does this go?" And Simon's, in addition to the person approaching in a human way, Simon reacts in a human way and says, "I don't know where this goes." So if Simon says, "I don't know," the person says, "This goes in the green bin." And the technology is coded so that it will actually parse that sentence and look for the word green, and then match the word green with the pixels that the camera sees, so that the next time it happens, Simon knows, oh, green is this collection of pixels. I see mostly this collection of pixels that look like this. I know that that's the color green, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was a really exciting project. There is a team of artificial intelligence specialists that work on all of these projects. These were a team of PhD students. Since then, I get approached constantly by that same lab. This was a follow-up project that is called Curie. Curie, I got that email that said, "Hey, do you want to design Simon's cousin?" And that was an exciting moment in my career. I was like, "What's a cousin? How are they related? Do they talk to each other?" And all of those kinds of things. So Curie is related with some physical features. The ears are a bit different. The idea behind this project is the same. Then a couple of years ago, I was approached, and Andrea said, "Hey, we're starting from a different place, and we're actually going to have the guts of the robot that are already defined. And I'm really sorry, Carla. This is it. It's going to be one arm that's kind of in the middle of the thing. We've got a camera that's on a rolling base." And I said, "Oh, this is a challenge. I like it." So I also was really tired of the humanoid representation, which is not necessarily a representation that I think is appropriate. It was appropriate for us as researchers to push the limits, but I don't think it's appropriate in everyday life. So I'm really always looking for the opportunity to abstract. And so for this one, since the machine was so harsh to begin with, what I wanted to do was, again, explore my interest in other materials that we don't typically think about for technology, and collaborated with a fashion designer. And I thought, I really want this robot to have a neoprene shell. And I found this woman, Lynn Stotzfus, who had done her entire thesis in neoprene. And we worked together, and I designed the shell for POLI, and also the head, so that, rather than being a box, it's something that you should talk to. It has a certain line of sight. It has ears that can hear. So this is just some of the process, and we did a fitting with the robot, et cetera, et cetera. So this is me with POLI. So again, even though we didn't want humanoid, what has been a constant theme in these projects and from all of the learnings are that the social interaction communicates so well, so clearly, and in such shorthand that we still want to retain social abilities, even if we're abstracting the form. So this robot can move its head. It can show you where its gaze is. It can show you who it's paying attention to if there are several people talking. And this project wound up morphing into something that was an opportunity for Dr. Tamaz to create a startup that is called Diligent Robotics. And for Diligent, she has retained me and actually appointed me the head of design for the company. And what was the opportunity was to have a social robot that would operate in the hospital setting. And one of the key aspects of being in the hospital is that the nurses are overworked, and they're actually doing work that is a bit like factory work, where they are in closets, they're getting pulled away from patients, they're running up and down hallways, they're exhausted, and they feel like they're not actually doing what they want to do, which is spend time with patients. So this is a rendering of NIXIE, which is the latest robot that I worked on, and is just starting to do its first shipping to clients in hospitals. So it's currently in hospitals right now in Texas. And so these projects are really, really intense in terms of interface and thinking about all of the ways that an object needs to communicate with a person and vice versa. So, we have a light up headband that is for long-term communication, like seeing from down the hallway. There is a backpack that has a screen. I'm thinking about the 10-inch interaction, the 10-foot interaction, the 2-foot interaction, and there is a socially expressive head because the hospital environment is particularly chaotic and does include people who are in the hallways, and so we needed that shorthand more than ever. So this is the kind of work that that NIXIE can do. The robot can go into a closet, can actually assemble kits of IVs, can assemble welcome kits, can assemble all kinds of other things, and then deliver those to outside the patient room. So and then there's all kinds of nuances about the robot in terms of how it will react if it goes close to a person, how it will react if it needs to ask for a person's assistance to say open a door, etc. How it will communicate what its state is, what job it's in the midst of. And here's a really interesting video of
what do nurses do, how do they do it, and how do we think about NIXIE fitting into those workflows.
Her little voice, when she passes you and says hello, and her eyes, she does seem to have a personality. We don't think of her as a thing, it's NIXIE.
During a month-long pilot, NIXIE stocked patient rooms, removed dirty linens, and took samples to the lab.
So this project is really, really fascinating for me because I feel so conflicted about the not wanting to be humanoid or overly cute, but yet having such a positive reaction to the robot being personable and having this personality that is very deliberately designed. So I've been really having a lot of joy and pleasure from seeing how this has been unfolding. And in terms of what I've been recently up to, this summer I did a workshop with the team. So these are just some of the kinds of projects that I do. I will actually have people do what's called body storming. And in 4D, we may have an improv workshop next semester because I feel that this body storming or acting out the scenes from the interaction with the robot, the interaction with the environment is really critical. And I'm in the midst of designing actually a whole suite of robots for the company. So these are just some early sketches. It's at very early stages. So one of the things that has always been really important for me and been challenging when I worked in consultancies and everything was very top secret was I really love to share my excitement for what I'm working on. And so outreach and thought leadership has been a big part of my studio. I've had some really wonderful opportunities to share my passion. The piece that I did for the Times does really capture how I see robotics in our everyday life. But I also I'm very aware that there's a lot of dystopian after effects of robotics and what is already in everyday life. And I very much want our community at large, inspired by conversations around questioning, what happens when we have this robot readable world and maybe culture is transformed? Do we start to use robot words in our language? Do we start to have robot signs on our buildings? Are our cities designed for robots and not for humans? And so that was an essay I did for Qualcomm. I was approached to do a piece for Popular Science that was around Tesla Autopilot, and in this one, I really questioned how is it that we are so misled into thinking that the vehicles that are only semi-autonomous, we are in a lull and thinking that they are fully autonomous. We have marketing that calls them things like autopilot. So this essay is really about putting the responsibility on designers to really let us know what is really going on in that robot brain and how should we be relying on it or not relying on it. And these are the kinds of issues that I also explore with my co-host, who is Dr. Tom Goriello, who is a PhD psychologist and a branding expert, and we run our podcast every other week. You can find it anywhere your podcasts are distributed. It is called the RoboPsych Podcast. And we look at issues of jobs. We look at issues of robots in healthcare, AI, empathy, kids, all of our fears, hopes, and dreams around robotics. Recently, this week, the last episode, we were exploring privacy. And all of what our technology can learn about us personally and what the implications of that are. And then I've also been very involved in working with kids. Periodically, I do workshops in museums and other places. And a few years ago, when I realized that desktop 3D printing was starting to become really prevalent, I created a project for myself. Again, this is kind of my MO, is how can I get my hands on the technology? And so I felt like I wanted to do a project around kids, because this is a shot from my alma mater, the Marymount School for Girls, that actually has a makerspace, a fab lab, and one of the first lower schools to do that in New York City. And so I created this story around a 3D printing robot that befriends a girl named Carla. And throughout the story, there are these objects that appear. And the objects, there's a URL at the end of the story, and the objects can actually be downloaded and printed. And so part of what I was thinking about here and what I've always thought about is, again, what the social interaction is with the technology. What is that relationship between the person and the robot? So these were some early sketches for what Leo might look like. And this one on the top right really kind of represents, like, he would approach a person, he would have a tray so he could offer what was printed. He has a tail that's made of here we have a little bit of what it's like. He's got this tail that heats up, and then it goes on a tray, and then the tray. I follow these sort of Star Wars books that inspire me when I'm doing my client work, so I had to make this anatomy of the robot that doesn't really appear in the book, but it was kind of just for me. There's a scanner in his eyes, there's this tray, there are these legs, he actually walks around. And I based this project on research with experts in the world of consumer 3D printing. And so I came up with 7 possible futures, and this was in 2014. The one is the one that already exists and was existing around prototyping. Then there's this future around a microfactory. Can a jewelry designer start with the robot and actually have that be her business without having to have the middleman? 3D printers at home, local store services, customization, 3D printed food. And so this is Stephanie. And again, this project was really enjoyable for me because it allowed me to dig deeply into not only the bigger picture of, what would online distribution of objects be like, but also some of the details, like what would it be like to create objects from an algorithm? So this is Python that interfaces with Rhino to create these patterns, and then that is what the jewelry actually was made. That's what's the model that was then just 3D printed. And then this is the scanner. So this is a kid who lives on Coney Island, and he likes to leave his footprints in the beach, and so he has this special shoe so that his friends know that he's the octopus. And so I also was based this on the model of a foot and built the model around it, and then 3D printed that. And then I had read a piece about laser sintering on the moon, and how researchers were looking at how we might have 3D printers that could operate using the lunar dust. And so this is a story about Charles and NIXIE. NIXIE is the robot, and Charles is a little boy whose mom is an astronaut architect. And he uses her 3D printer to make this house for his hamster. This was a really exciting project because my experiment was not with the 3D printer, because I had been doing lots of 3D printing as a professional designer. It was with the idea of online distribution of virtual files that didn't actually exist physically except in the cloud, that would then appear all over the world. So since that time and up to this date, I see posts on social media, on Thingiverse, emails of people who have made the objects. The sheep is by far the most popular. But every once in a while, I also get these really amazing emails. This one came in from a library in Scotland, and they said, we are the first library in the UK to have a 3D printer, and we love your book because we do readings with visually impaired kids. And because we printed the objects, they can actually feel the characters and feel parts of the story in their hands. And so that one really gave me goosebumps. And the last thing I wanted to show in my talk are some latest experiments, like really rough and sloppy, but what we're doing in 4D and what's exciting and what's scary. And I'm really interested in sharing this idea of experimenting with social robotics in quick and dirty experiments. So I have a series of robot kits and sometimes I'm working on the form of the robot, sometimes I'm working on how the robot is programmed. So this is something I worked on over the summer for an Instagram post just to get people excited. So rough and dirty, just to really looking at just this moment. I also took the Lickestra on the road for one of our Board of Governors meeting, and made a super size light up 8-person Lickestra that was at the Third Man. That had this it was really actually a nice stage presence to have it up on this public stage. And in this one, collaborated with Gretchen Davidson, who is a noise musician and on our board and part of the Davidson Foundation. And so that was pretty fun. A month ago, I put together a panel that was called Redefine Everything. And I had some folks who are working on public projects. And this is Brian Boyer, who is a strategist who works on future visions for autonomous vehicles. So this is one thing I'm very, very interested in, is building a dialogue between Cranbrook, Detroit, and the world at large around the implications of technology in cities and everyday life. And then another thing that I had done last semester is we have this fabulous space. It's called 1301 Broadway. Looks like that. It's got windows all around. So building on the theme of social interaction with machines, as well as the theme of seeing work only through a window, I took on the space and treated it as my lab or just my studio that people could walk into and see a work in progress that was not finished. So this is, again, really rough around the edges. I called it Medusa, and I was interested in really creating a social robot that kind of fit within the space. The space is not a white cube. It is more of a rough and tumble raw space that's perfect for workshops. It's perfect for shows that are going to be experimental in nature. And so what I created was this robot with 7 heads that can see what's happening outside and will lift one of its heads to follow somebody who approaches the window. And we had I held meetings there. I had folks come in and interact with the robot. So this is the robot has this camera vision that I had coded to see what the activity was. And then it actually had these mirrors on the faces of each of the heads. So it was this thing that just kind of came to life and was using the language of industrial materials. Here's another video of this Medusa. So as people walk by, it would raise its head to acknowledge their presence. And this, for me, was an interest in what a lot of research are terming soft robotics. So the main thing that I was really wanting to explore and would like to continue to explore in this next year is how can we use soft materials to create robotic movement. Each of these only has one motor in it with a cord that is pulled on a rib, and you can create some really interesting movement by just building soft structures that have a rib structure within them that gets pulled taut or loose. And so soft robotics, I think, is a really wide open field that is ripe for exploration. And this was one of the first things, and these are just some moments from there. But one of my favorite moments was not what I had planned at all, but just, again, I'm really interested in the body and the relationship to the robot, and I kind of love just this like playing around with it as this creature that, you know, would have a life of its own, and I could be kind of intimate with in this weird way. So this is parts of the robot just kind of doing its thing, writhing on my shoulders, so to speak. So I'm very interested in the pursuit. Anybody who wants to talk about soft robotics, I would love to talk about that. This last project was a piece that I did as an installation as part of our studio weekend here, and it's called Sonified Cranbrook. I had invited Scooby Leposki, who is alum from print media, who is a composer, to work with me on a collaboration, and we worked very closely. And he had been doing a series of compositions that used data from plant life, and the data was the core of the musical composition. So he had these electrodes that get placed directly on the plant, and the data from those electrodes feeds his music, and he builds a composition around it. So what I had proposed was that we pick some of our favorite spots around Cranbrook. And one of the things I really love at Cranbrook is exploring outside of the academy. And any of you who have not done that, I really encourage you to walk around and really go around Kingswood Lake and see some of the other more remote to us parts of the campus. And so together, we had worked on the series of experiences based on MIDI controllers, which is a language that it's a protocol that musicians use. And essentially, these 3 things are musical instruments that we plug sensors into. And one of the first spots, so there's Scooby climbing up the tree. One of the first spots was this tree that we call the canopy tree that is amazing, because it has just a little opening, and you walk in, and it is a room inside. And so we use these ultrasonic sensors that would respond to people's positions in the tree and shift the composition based on where they were walking. So this is actually from inside the tree. And then the next spot is called Lucifer Landing. So this is the rock formation that's on the hill just down from the Institute of Science. And what we did here was we were looking at what happens when somebody casts a shadow, and we were riffing on the rock structure and used percussive sounds for this composition. So it's my shadow that's triggering the sound. So as people walk, and depending if there was more than one person, there would be layered sounds. Got to jog a little there. And so to wrap up, the last one was in the Japanese garden. And we worked really hard on this. I had sent Scooby different recordings of the waterfall that's right under this is the Japanese bridge, and he actually composed music that was tuned to the waterfall. And what we did is we created this magic, this surprise element when people walked over the bridge. So So that is my love letter to the Cranbrook campus. Thank you.